I just want to bring something about Genesis.
Absolutely.
That verse in Genesis that
you're going to use the verse.
Genesis 30. No, it's just really, it's a cool point.
Yeah.
Genesis, so here, Yeshua is saying, not one letter, right? That's the first word, and the other word is nikudah, dot.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's leave that for the plus section, the nikudah, the dot, the vowel.
Okay.
But the letters, here's how important letters are,
Come on.
okay? So here we have, in Genesis 30:32, Jacob makes a deal with Laban, and he says, I'm going to pass through, and then every lamb or every seh, which is a young lamb or a young goat, that is nakod, which is dotted, that's going to have the status where I'm going to be paid, I'm going to get that. That's going to be mine. And then we hear later that Laban keeps changing the rules. And what does he do? And you miss this, I think, in English, right? Is it spotted or is it speckled or bespeckled or whatever, right? Or brindled or whatever these terms are. He's using these cute terms, but in Hebrew, it's a difference between nun kuf daled, nakod, and ayin kuf daled, akod. And akod and nakod, they sound very similar. So imagine you're Laban and you said, or you're Jacob, and you said, okay, here's our deal. You get all the animals that don't have any spots on them, right? Because the wool is worth more if it doesn't have these, if it's uniform in color. And I'll take all the lower value stuff, the nakod stuff. And later, Laban looks around and he sees all these dots on the animals, and he said, okay, you can have all the akod stuff.
He changes the rules.
He changes the pronunciation.
Yes.
He changes the nun to an ayin.
Yeah.
And what he ends up doing is ripping off Laban and deceiving him. And I think this is a profound picture that if one letter changes in the Word of God, you can completely change the meaning.
My goodness.
And I think that's what Yeshua is saying. I mean, what Yeshua is saying is like mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Before we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, what Yeshua said might not have made that much sense, because you could have said, well, there was no and they did say this. The Masoretes made up that text in the time of Yeshua, and I'm not even talking about the vowels, I'm talking only about the consonants, the word ot there, right? And even if you take it in Greek, it's one jot or one tittle, right? Mm-hmm. It could be understood there as it's one iota, one yud, and one koraya is the word, which is a diacritical mark. We'll talk about that when we get to the vowels. But one yud, right? The small little stroke. It's a single stroke of a small stroke of the pen, right? And there were definitely yuds in the time of Yeshua, and some people understand that as the little serifs that you had on the letters, right? We'll bring a source that talks about that. Even on that level, even from the Greek, what Yeshua said was hard to understand before we had the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now that we know about the Proto-Masoretic manuscripts, and we can see texts from the time that predate Yeshua by 200 years, or his birth at least, we can see that, they were correcting texts according to some master version. Yes. And where did that master version sit? We have the sources that talk about this. There was a guild of scribes called the Temple Courtyard Proofreaders. And the rabbis some of these rabbis, quite frankly, were kind of like these ancient Jewish accountants. And what do I mean by that? So the discussion there in the Talmud about these scribes is during the time of the temple, who paid for the salary of the Temple Courtyard Proofreaders, right? And it's kind of like, oh, by the way, there was this thing called Temple Courtyard Proofreaders, but because we're talking about, how they get paid and right, we're talking about financial matters, and they're remembering, where those funds came from. But from that, we learned there was this guild of scribes where you would bring them your scroll of Isaiah that you wrote, and they would go through and they would check every letter and say, uh-oh, you're missing a vav here. You've got an extra vav there. You're missing a letter here. And they would try the best they could to match your text to this master text that existed in the temple.
Nehemia.
So when Yeshua says one letter will not be canceled from the Torah, he had this reality he was living in, that there were people checking every single letter and matching it to what was in the temple. Yes. And so he comes along and says one letter and one nikudah, one dot will not be canceled, and for all will be sustained.